Hey, welcome to the D Word Podcast. Now, I have not done a podcast in 1 year. 1 year. Can you believe that? 1 year. And the reason why I haven't done a podcast in 1 year, well, I needed some time to think about what worked on my podcast and what didn't work. Now, if you were consuming my podcast from back in the lockdown era, back in 2020, you would know that I started off my podcast interviewing some amazing minds who have also been great friends of mine, but also these people had interesting stories to share. Now, I know how we dub podcasts, and I was also guilty of that back then, where if you look at how the world does podcasts, you have to have a guest, and the guest and you together create a great conversation. That is true. But over time, I realized that sustaining guests every single week was not practical. And if I look back at all the podcasts I did from back in 2020 till 2022, the podcast with the best reaction and the best hits were the podcasts where I was really raw and talking my truth. So I took a year and a bit to look back at all the podcasts and reshape or remodel what I'm doing here on my podcast. Now, if you are watching the podcast on YouTube, just to give you a side note, a podcast is an audio-based content that can be consumed on the go. That is what the definition is. Trust the radio guy when I say that. And if you are looking at a video version of a podcast, it's actually called a vodcast or a vidcast. Google it if you don't believe me. So that's the difference. So if you're watching a vodcast on YouTube, subscribe to my channel. And if you are consuming the podcast on Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, wherever you get it, make sure you also subscribe. But I'm also here to share with you something very important today. Every single Monday going forward, I will release a brand new episode of the D Word Podcast. And to make it fresh and cool, I'm going to start labeling them episode 1, 2, 3, 4. So you know what episodes you are listening to. And if you missed out on 1 or 2, you know where to go. I just feel that the D Word Podcast is at its best season right now to dish out some of the stuff that I've learned over the years. And I will start by just reintroducing myself as just a radio guy who wants to share stories here on our podcast. Many don't know this, but when you do a radio show, you only have 3 to 4 minutes to talk about something, which isn't a lot of time if you think about how much more can be shared on a podcast and how you can take your own pace delivering that, because that is the beauty of a podcast. So if you have never listened to me on radio or you've never consumed any of my podcast, you are going to love what is coming your way in this season of the D Word Podcast. But I got to correct myself. I'm not going to be editing things out of my podcast. I just dislike the fact when you see someone's podcast very heavily edited, because you know mistakes can happen. But I believe that if I want to be real with you here, I have to be uncut, unedited, and just give my free-flowing conversation with you. So if that is what you want to consume here on the D Word Podcast, you are going to love everything I have to share with you in these conversations. So starting this week and every single Monday, you will get a brand new podcast here on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Google Podcast. Now, there's a side note. Because I believe that everybody loves watching a podcast, watching a vodcast, I also believe that I needed to get both sides in the same lane. So what I am going to be doing is I am sometimes going to have conversations that are exclusive only on audio, which is the podcast, and some of them will be only on vodcast on the YouTube. So make sure that you follow me on all platforms and follow me on my socials. I'm Dion G on every platform. And the biggest takeaway I think that you are going to love from all the podcast is I am giving you a chance to also ask me a question during every single podcast. So make sure that you submit questions via my Twitter or via my Instagram, and let me know what are some of the questions you have. It could be about anything. It could be about me, it could be about life. And at the end of every podcast, I am going to be answering some of those questions the best way I can. I have to give a bit of a shout out to my TikTok fam, because my TikTok fam has inspired me to restart this podcast. And the reason why I say that is every morning I go live on TikTok and I just share these conversations minus the microphone. And a lot of people wanted the podcast back. I actually was a little bit weary as to when to bring it back, but I felt that over time, the more people I shared stories with on TikTok, many said, I wish there was a video version of this for us to keep forever. So this is it. The D-Word podcast is back. There'll be a new labeling system on each episode from 1 going forward. So make sure you never miss the podcast. I've got so much to share. So much to share. Who am I? Where have I been? And why am I talking about life? All this and more will be revealed in the D-Word podcast. And I'm excited. So subscribe and stay glued, or whichever word you want to use, to a podcast, because that is how it's going to be. The D-Word podcast starting now. After all, this is the intro.